Okay, so for today's lesson, we're going to learn the last method of solving a quadratic function or a quadratic equation, and that is going to be called completing the square. Okay, so we are going to be learning how to complete the square. So all that completing the square means is we're going to be taking a quadratic equation and we're going to be making it into a perfect square. Now, we've talked about perfect square functions before. That was when it followed that ax squared plus 2ab plus b squared rule. So let's just, again, kind of go over what a perfect square equation is. So like I said, a perfect square quadratic function is anything that's in the form ax squared plus 2ab plus b squared. Okay, this is a perfect square trinomial. And we talked about what that means back in a previous section. And honestly, it's not like we really need to know too much what it means, seeing as we're going to be making our functions look like this. So the first thing we want to do is we want to be able to create a perfect square trinomial. And what that means is, let's say I had the function x squared plus 4x plus c. And I wanted to know what value of c would make this a perfect square trinomial. Meaning, what number could I put here? What number could I put in place of c to make this a perfect square trinomial? Okay, make it so that it follows this format. So the easiest way to do that is basically a two-step process. The first step, you're going to take half of b. Okay, you're going to take 1/2 of b. Now, what is b again? B is the coefficient of x, right? Remember, it's ax squared plus bx plus c. All right, we're going to kind of forget about this for right now. So b is the coefficient of x. So in this case, my b is 4, so I'm going to take half of 4. That's step one, take half of b. All right, so in this case, half of 4 divided by 2 is 2. Okay, that's step one. Step two, square that. Whatever you get for half of b, you're going to take that and you're going to square it. So in this case, 2 squared is 4. That is the value that will make this a perfect square trinomial. So what that means is, for my answer of what number could I put in place of c to make this a perfect square trinomial, my answer would be c equals 4. Because all I had to do was take half of b and then square it. Half of 4 is 2. 2 squared is 4. So if it ever asks you to just find c, or what value of c would make this a perfect square trinomial, take b, divide it by 2, and then square it. Let's do one more of those. So let's say I had, where is it? R squared minus 8r plus c. And again, I want to know what value of c will make this a perfect square trinomial. Well, all I do, I look at my b. b is negative 8. So I do negative 8 divided by 2. That's going to be negative 4. And then I take that and I square it. Negative 4 squared is positive 16. So in this case, my c would be 16. That would make this a perfect square trinomial. That's how we find c. That's how we make this a perfect square trinomial. So in order to solve this stuff, we need to know how to find c first. That's kind of the main idea here, is understanding how to find c, how to make this a perfect square trinomial. So now let's take this idea and let's use this to solve. So now let's say I had the equation x squared minus 6x plus 12 equals 19. And I want to solve this by completing the square. Well, the first step in completing the square is to get ax squared and bx on one side of the equation and everything else on the other side of the equation. Okay, so what I mean by that is this part right here, the x squared and the x, I want that on one side of my equation. I want all of my other numbers on the other side of the equation. Okay, so in this case, I'm going to take this plus 12, excuse me, and I'm going to subtract 12 from both sides. So I'm going to end up with the equation x squared minus 6x equals 7. And this is what I want. This is exactly what I want. I want the x squared and the x on one side, and I want the number on the other side. Because now what I'm able to do is I'm able to take the side with the variables and complete the square. Do exactly what I just did in the previous problems. Take a number here. Figure out what number could I add on to this. What number could I make c in order to make this a perfect square trinomial? But you have to think about it this way. Now we're working with an equation. Over here, we weren't working with equations, right? We were just working with an expression. But when we're working with an equation, if I add c onto one side of an equation, that means I have to add c to both sides of the equation. So when we're doing this, we're just going to make sure whatever c we get, we add to both sides of the equation. So I'm going to do the same process to find c. I'm going to take my b, which in this case is negative 6. So I'm going to take negative 6, I'm going to divide it by 2, which gives me negative 3. And then I'm going to square that, which gives me 9. So my c in this case is 9. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add 9 to both sides of the equation. And now I end up with x squared minus 6x plus 9 equals 7 plus 9 is going to give us 16. So that's the first step in solving by completing the square, is to make it a perfect square. And now we have a perfect square. Now the reason that we make this a perfect square is because if you remember, when we solve this, we're going to now factor this perfect square. And a perfect square gets factored very nicely, very easily. A perfect square gets factored into a single equation or a single parenthesis squared. Okay? And this actually is factored very simple because we already know what's going to go in here. You're going to have your variable, whatever it may be, and then you're going to get whatever this number is right here. When you did b divided by 2, this negative 3, that is going to be the next part. That's going to be the number that you put here. So it's going to be x minus 3. And that's how this perfect square trinomial gets factored. Right? Now, again, you could go the long method and say what two numbers, multiply to get 9 and add to get negative 6, and you'll get negative 3 and negative 3, and you'll realize that they're both the same, and you can put it as a squared. And if you want to do that, that's fine. But this is a little bit of a shortcut now. Now that we're completing the square, we're making it a perfect square trinomial, we should know what number is going to go here because of the b over 2. Okay, so now I'm left with this idea here. I have this x minus 3 squared equals 16. I need to solve this still. The reason we complete the square, the reason we do this is because I can get rid of the square. If you remember, to get rid of a square, you square root. So now I'm going to square root both sides. The square root and the square now are now gone, and I'm left with just the x minus 3. Well, the square root of 16, that's just 4. And now I have a nice simple equation here, but remember, when we take the square root of a number, it's not just 4, it's plus or minus 4. You do have to remember that. That's the biggest thing that people will forget, is this plus or minus. So technically, this is actually saying you have two equations. x minus 3 is equal to positive 4, and x minus 3 is equal to negative 4. Two different equations, but none of them are very difficult. Now it's just solve them. So in both cases, I'm going to add 3 to both sides. In this one, 4 plus 3 gives me 7, and in this one, negative 4 plus 3 will give me negative 1. So my two answers for this equation will be 7 and negative 1. Alright, so I have a problem here up on the screen. I'd like you to try this one on your own. For this one, it will not be a perfect number like we got before. You will get a decimal here. So let's just round these to the nearest tenth when you get your answer. So again, take 5 minutes, pause the video, try this on your own. Remember, first, you want to get all the numbers to one side. Then you want to create a perfect square trinomial, do the b over 2, and then square it. Add that number to both sides. And then you can factor by finding the b over 2, and then you can solve it that way. So again, take 5 minutes, pause the video here. Okay, so hopefully these are the answers that you got. X would be 12.4 or X would be negative 0.4. So again, first step, take the 3, move it to the other side, subtract it from both sides. So you get x squared minus 12x equals 5. Now we want to complete the square. Take b, divide it by 2, negative 12 divided by 2 is negative 6. Negative 6 squared gives us positive 36, so I add 36 to both sides. This is now a perfect square trinomial that will factor to be x minus 6 squared equals 36 plus 5 is 41. I now take the square root of both sides. The square and the square root get to cancel out, so I'm left with just the x minus 6. And the square root of 41 is approximately 6.4, but I don't forget the plus or minus in front. Now I just split it up into two different equations, one where it's a positive 6.4 and one where it's a negative 6.4. Add 6 to both sides of both equations, and that's where I end up with my 12.4 and my negative 0.4. Okay, so all the ones that we've done so far have had an a coefficient of 1, meaning the number in front of the x squared has been 1. Well, what happens when it's not 1? Meaning, like, if I have the equation negative 2x squared plus 8x minus 18 equals 0. What happens if I have this? Okay, well, we can only complete the square if my a is 1. So in this case, my a is not 1. So if we are told that we have to solve this by completing the square, the first thing we have to do is get rid of a by dividing everything by whatever that a may be. I have to divide the entire equation, everything, by negative 2. I cannot have an a in order to complete the square. So if I do, I divide it throughout the entire equation. So I do negative 2x squared divided by negative 2. That's just going to give me x squared. 8 divided by negative 2. That's going to give me negative 4x. Negative 18 divided by negative 2. That's going to give me a positive 9. And 0 divided by negative 2. That's still just 0. Now I can do exactly what I was doing in my previous problems, because now I have a coefficient of a being 1. So I now can complete the square. I'm going to move my c to the other side. I'm going to subtract the 9. So I have x squared minus 4x equals negative 9. Now I complete the square. Take my b, divide it by 2. I get negative 2. Take that and square it, and I get my c. I'm going to take that 4, and I'm going to add it to both sides of the equation. This now is a perfect square trinomial, which gets factored to be x minus 2 squared. Again, remember, it's the minus 2 here. So it's the variable minus 2 squared equals negative 9 plus 4. That's going to give me negative 5. So now here, what I would do is I would square root both sides, right? I want to square root both sides. But now we run into a problem. I can't take the square root of negative 5. That is impossible. Remember, you can never take the square root of a negative number. So does that mean I did something wrong? No, not at all. All that means is that this has no solutions. And I really should say it's no real solutions, because again, in 2 years you'll talk about imaginary numbers and everything. But for right now, we could just say that there is no solution. So if you run into this where you have to take the square root of a negative number, stop there and say you have no solution. Okay? No, this will not happen every time that you have to take the a and move it. This is just a one-off thing. Okay? So don't think that you could always do this. Okay, so again, there's a problem up on the screen. I'd like you guys to try this on your own. Again, take 5 minutes, pause the video, do this on your own. Just remember, it has an a. We can't have an a if we want to complete the square. So get rid of the a first, divide it through, then complete the square, and then you can solve. And again, we'll round this to the nearest tenth again. No reason to go past the 10th. Alright, so pause the video and try this. Okay, so hopefully you got the two answers I have here, 4.7 and negative 1.7. So again, first step, divide everything by 3. When you divide 3x squared by 3, you get x squared. Negative 9 divided by 3, you get negative 3. Negative 3 divided by 3, you get negative 1. 21 divided by 3, 7. Now I want to complete the square. So I bring the number to the other side, so I add 1. So I get x squared minus 3x equals 8. I take my b, I divide it by 2. Negative 3 divided by 2 is negative 1.5. Square that, I get 2.25. So I'm adding 2.25 to both sides. Now that this is a perfect square trinomial, it factors very nicely to be the variable, and then this number here, minus 1.5 squared, equals 8 plus 2.25 is 10.25. I now take the square root of both sides, so I'm left with whatever's inside here, x minus 1.5 equals the square root of 10.25, and your calculator gives you 3.2, so it's just plus or minus 3.2. I now come over here and I just solve both the positive 3.2 and the negative 3.2. Add 1.5 to both sides. That's where I end up with my 4.7 and my negative 1.7.